Welcome to Pause for the Truth. I am Jocelyn Turner. So happy to be with you today. Now, if you live in Florida, where I do, the weather is pretty yucky outside. So if we have some technical difficulties, then that is the issue that we're having here in Jacksonville. Dr. Kane, how's it going for you on your end? I know you're the one I'm talking about when it comes to technical difficulties this evening.
Yeah, it's running pretty. I dropped the computer the other day, so they mad at me. Got a cracked screen, but I guess I'll do it from the phone until I can do something otherwise. Good evening, everybody.
Well, we know how to improvise, Dr. Kane, and so with our faithful listeners, hopefully they know that things happen. So tonight we're going to have a real
Yeah,
interesting discussion. And it's a topic that we don't talk about often, particularly minorities. We don't have that conversation often, and I know it's something that we need to talk about, and that is why should minorities participate in clinical trials? During this pandemic, we know more people became, as Dr. Odedna would say, or what do you call citizen scientists, you would think, because they then became the experts on why or why not to take the COVID vaccine. So we'll get into that in a moment, but let me introduce our guest tonight. Dr. Kim Barbell Johnson. I'm calling her a regular on the show because she's been on the show with us. Oh, was that last week? Okay, last week when and she came back to join us. She had such a good time that she felt, you know what? I think I'll hang out with them again next Tuesday. So how are
I
you doing
love
this evening,
to.
Dr.
I'm
Johnson?
doing great. Thank you again for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be here. And you have one of my favorite people in this city on the podcast tonight. So that's not you, Dr. Kane, even though you're still up there. So, it's my pleasure to be back to talk about a topic that I'm pretty passionate about.
Thank you, and welcome. And you're right, we have the world-renowned Dr. Falakami Odetna, and I met Dr. Odetna years ago because of my passion and her passion for men's health, as far as prostate cancer, for one of the many things that she has studied over the years. So we are so fortunate to have Dr. Odetna. When I first met Dr. Odetna, she was with my beloved University of Florida, but now she's with Mayo Clinic. How are you doing this evening, Dr. Odetna?
I am doing so well, and it's so wonderful. I mean, this is like it's like putting the group of perfect people, as Dr. J said, in a room together. So I'm hanging out with you, Miss Todd. I'm hanging out with my sister, Dr. Johnson, and I'm hanging out with Dr. Kane. And Dr. Kane, sorry to displace you from Dr. Johnson, but we have become close sisters also. So here I am. I am doing very well.
it wouldn't be the first time.
So I'm gonna this is a topic that can be kind of uncomfortable for people, Dr. Odetna, because I know I shared with you recently when I was a younger woman and I was approached about participating in a clinical trial. And quite frankly, my decision was based on different factors at the time. It was a clinical trial that required me to take off work and come in a couple of days a week for a few months. And that was my only reservation, simply based on the time away from work. So tell me, why do you think people have reluctancy about now, do I want to start with the reluctancy, or do you think we should start with why should we participate in clinical trials? Let's start there, Dr. Detna. Why should we
Yeah.
participate?
So before I go on, I will first of all defer to my sister, Dr. Johnson, to first of all describe what is clinical trials. Right.
Good point.
I think it's so crucial, and that we have that great understanding of what is and what is not. But I'd love for her to talk about it, and then I will come in. I'm happy to talk about what is, the barriers that we face. And I actually want to throw out some numbers as well, which I think is the number game. And it's very important that we know those numbers.
Okay, hit it, Dr. Johnson.
Well, it's like we all have a hidden agenda, because before we do that, I just wanted to recognize my first association with Dr. Flocky, only because it is exactly 1 year ago tomorrow that I met the gracious doctor. I don't think you had transitioned yet to Mayo Clinic. And so we're celebrating sort of an anniversary. And I recall being, I believe it was the COVID-19, overcoming COVID-19 in the Black community panel on March 16th last year, where both of you actually were present, sponsored by Care 2 Health Equity Center of UF. And I remember actually seeing a sister in research more passionate than any that as passionate as the most passionate that I'd ever encountered, who was not only talking about COVID from a space that it was impacting our community, but really dropping significant pearls about clinical trials and clinical research. And I really walked away inspired and educated. And so I'm just seriously and sincerely so honored to be here, and really wanted to acknowledge that 1 year anniversary. For as bad as COVID-19 has been, it has given us some significant opportunities to do some great things together. And I think this is one of them. So thank you so much for being in our space tonight, and for continuing to be who you are to so many people, those you know and those that you don't know. But as I've been on the panel on the show before, I really have my CV discussed multiple times. I'm a clinical researcher by day. I'm a family physician by training and residency and specialty training. For the last 10 years, I have been what we call a principal investigator for clinical trials. And clinical trials is what we call that space where we actually engage, screen, and recruit and randomize patients to studies. And those studies can be different phases of studies, from studies that we test certain things with healthy populations, phase 1 trials, and then figure out how we're going to do the trial and then move that study protocol along. Or they can be survey studies. So we have multiple different kinds of studies, interventional. And so while the types of studies are many, the clinical trial itself is really just an opportunity outside of the standard clinical space for us to gain more information about a subject, whether it is, and in the medical space, whether it's a disease, whether it is an attitude or perception, whether it is a novel treatment, whether it is how one group of people react or respond to things. And these are created by hypotheses. Scientists like us get together and we discuss what is it that we want to study, and we create a space to say, how are we going to study that? And in a clinical trial, because we've evolved in this space for so long, it is so regulated that we can't just say we're going to have human subjects in the trial and do whatever we want to. It's a very regulated and meticulous space for documentation and for ethical and moral conduction of what we do. So the trial itself is, so in short, the clinical trial is that space away from clinical medicine or traditional clinical medicine, where we have the opportunity to evaluate different conditions and different populations of patients. And so that's basically the short of it, with understanding that there are multiple phases and different ways that different types of trials and different ways that patients are recruited to those trials based on the country that we're in.
Are all clinical trials, I'm sorry, Dr. Dedna, Dr. Johnson, are all clinical trials based on things we have to put in our mouths or be injected with, or are some clinical trials not based on oral medications?
Yeah, so they're clinical trials that say whether or not the face cream that we use this morning is going to work. They're clinical trials that look at how I feel about being a physician post-COVID. So clinical trials basically gives us an integrity. It gives us the integrity to say, if it is truly a clinical trial, it will be done with this academic rigor so that we can use the statistics that we know exist, that we can use common language in this space to test whatever we're going to test, such that when we make a conclusion of something being inferior or superior or better or worse, that data can be translated to any other group that find experiment research trial is repeated. So so the short answer is anything. We can do anything within the clinical trial space, depending on what the question is that we're trying to answer.
Okay, thank you. All right, Dr. Odette, it's on you.
Yeah. So, thank you for that wonderful foundation, Dr. Johnson. I wanted to say, Ms. Turner, you asked a great question when you say are all clinical trials, because a lot of times we often think clinical trials is what we put in the mouth. But actually, the NIH just expanded also within the last couple of years the definition of clinical trials to also involve behavioral interventions as well. So if we feel that one kind of diet is better than another kind of diet, we can randomize people to test. If we feel that having a community garden is really good and would get you the healthy food, you can randomize. So as long as you are randomizing people into different interventions, and then you are testing whether it works or it doesn't work. That is the definition of clinical trial. So it has really been broadened. And so I wanted also to take a step back because it's very important to hear that foundation from Dr. Johnson. Let's just kind of take back and let's see where we are as Black folks with respect to clinical trials. Before we get to clinical trials, there's what is called as the preclinical stage. Before we get to the preclinical stage, there's what is called the basic discovery, right? There's what is called the genomic analysis, the fundamental research that we do. Well, our problem with participating in research starts from the fundamental of participating in this basic discovery research. So what does that mean? When we don't participate in basic discovery research, we really don't know from early on whether our genes is really, predisposed to certain things that we need to use for preclinical trials. And then we get to clinical trials and we still don't participate in clinical trials. So it's really a critical problem that we really need to address. So let's get to the advantage of participating in clinical trials. The participation in clinical trial is so important for all populations because the clinical trial is asking basic questions. Is this intervention, is this therapy, is this drug, is it safe in you? Is it effective in you? Now, when we look at our population as Black, right, our DNA and our genetic makeup are so unique and are so different, right? We think about it. Number one, we are all originated from Africa. Africa has the most heterogeneity of genes in all the world because we are the foundation. It is the oldest population. So we come with that. And then when we're talking about African Americans, we talk about the fact that there's a lot of admixture that has gone on over the years. And so a typical African American will have about 75% of makeup of African ancestry, but may also have from European ancestry as well, and also native Indians. So there's such unique things about being African American that is so important that we participate in these studies to know whether this drugs is going to work in us or is not going to work in us. So this is not about let's better it and see whether it's going to work. The problem that we have, because I hear a lot of people say, I don't want to be the guinea pig. Look, we have to make a decision. Do we participate under a controlled condition that really allows us to get to know how it works in us, or do we become the guinea pig after the drug is out? Because the drug is going to be approved, right? Now, I just reviewed recent.
That was powerful, Doc.
It is the truth. I'm going to give you statistics to back this up. I just reviewed the latest drugs that were approved by FDA in 2020. About 5,000 were approved. About 5,900 and something drugs were approved by FDA. Do you know the percentage of Blacks that participate in this about 5,000 drugs?
15%.
5%, my lady.
Wow.
5%. Do you know what is even more revealing? So I went in detail and said, let me take a look at those drugs and let me see the composition of percentage. There were some drugs that had 0% Blacks. For example, drug for Parkinson's disease, 0% Black, it was still approved. Now let's think about that, right? Whether we participate or not, these drugs are going to come out. And guess who's going to prescribe this drug for you. Your physician is going to prescribe this drug for you, and we are being tested on without any control.
Wow. Yeah, that's an interesting. That's a
yeah.
very.
I just want to lay that foundation for all of us to understand. So
that's a very interesting way to put it out there. Either we, and it's almost like I tell people when they say that they don't want to stop smoking or they don't want to do this. I was like, either you pay for it now or you pay for it later, right? So the consequences of things, and even the deodorant that we use was a clinical trial. When Dr. Johnson was talking about the face cream that we use this morning, you know what one of my friends said? She told her son, when he said he didn't want to take, when you said that I don't want to be, he said, I don't want to be somebody's guinea pig or when it comes to the COVID vaccine. I don't know what's in it. She said, but do you know what's in that wacky weed you're smoking?
And there's actually, in fairness, there's actually studies that are ongoing, particularly at university centers for cannabis. And we're not as aggressive in asking those questions. But the point is,
the whole point, Dr. Johnson, is we take in a lot of things.
We do. I in the COVID space, I've responded with things like plastic containers that we used to put our food in, and the toxic things that are in the plastic containers themselves that over time can impact our risk for certain diseases. So there's a lot that we don't know, and this is not necessarily a space to judge or to blame, but why I actually said the face creams is I went to buy something and I was wondering why it wasn't working on me. And when I realized what I was buying, I was just buying it because it was top of the line and all my Facebook friends were using it. And there was 0 blacks in that study for that face cream. And so everything isn't regulated the same way by the FDA. So sometimes you have to go looking for what's the particular cream was actually studied in China and it did not include any ethnic minorities. So obviously I recognize that maybe that's why it's not working in me. But actually our good doctor actually started at a place that I wanted to start, because like a good mentee, I also did look up before coming on here the FDA's information regarding what they call a drug snapshot for 2020. And because I'm in primary care and, Dr. Detna is a cancer specialist, a hematology professor, and I have the basic scope of care. So I look at these reports often to look at the drugs and what is going on that may be impacting patients who would traditionally see a family physician, for example. And there are so many trials that not all the trials are happening only in the United States. So the nice thing about this report is it tells you the percentage of the people in the trial that were in the US, and then it breaks it down by women and men, Blacks, white, Asian, Hispanics, and those over 65. So, and it's public knowledge. So it's a report that's actually provided so that anyone can actually go to the FDA website and get these demographics. And I think it would be interesting to actually see exactly what, what we're talking about. And so diversity for clinical trials includes ethnic minorities, because we know that race is a social construct. So we really need to go to the ethnicity and even the family of origin ethnicity. And that information we're only going to get in that genomic space. But if you're not playing the game, you can't win the game, right? So if we're not in these studies, there's no way that we can actually benefit from the information. And I don't want anybody to walk away and to think that they need to abandon any of the treatment that they've been prescribed because they look on the list and no Black people were in those studies, because sometimes we have to use what we have and we make some anecdotal decisions about the use and efficacy in the clinical space. So this is just knowledge is power, and this is really a conversation for us to have to say why we need to continue to advocate for our presence in this space. The comment that I made about skincare was interesting, because as we look at the trials and look at trends, you'll see this lack, this less than 10% in many clinical trials. You'll see the preponderance of our presence in psychoactive drug trials for schizophrenia and other things, which will make you ask the question, why are we 5 and 6% in some trials, but we're 24% in other trials? So it makes you ask the question, where are we recruiting for those trials? How are those trials being conducted, and where are we going to get the information for those trials? I'm glad we're present, but when we're over present in a trial where we're not the population, that the only population that has that disease. We also need to look at that as scientists and make sure that we hold accountable the researchers who are bringing those drugs and doing those studies. But I thought it was most curious when I went not only just to 2020, and I will shut up after this, but to the 2015-2016 snapshot. I wanted to see, are we getting better or worse? And we're 1% better, from the 2015 to now, because I like trends in terms of our presence as Blacks in clinical trials that were approved that year by the FDA. But one of the trials with the highest number of Blacks was, I'm not going to name the drug, but it was a drug that the indication is for double chin, right? And it was a percentage, 85% women in that trial, 8% African Americans. There's a higher percentage in this trial for double chin intervention than for some of the things that are killing us as Black people. So again, it's not necessarily that we just, everybody is afraid to be in a trial or is concerned about some historical Tuskegee study. It depends on what personally of value to you. And I think that we really need to kind of address and be honest with ourselves about why we are not reaching those who need to be in these trials. And on the other side, be honest when you're on the other side of saying, what are you afraid of? Why are you not in these trials? And I think one of the things that I'll take away from this is exactly what was said. Do you want to be in a trial now, or do you want to be in a real world trial after the prescription is written?
But Dr. Johnson and Dr. Odedna, either one of you can respond. As a question was just posted from our audience, is how do we then dispel the perception or the conversation that's taken place within our families about the history of participating in clinical trials, and dare not I say the Tuskegee study?
Mm-hmm. I can give it a shot. We can acknowledge this. But I want to also say that majority of the time, the reason for us not wanting to participate, first of all, let's just stand back. And this is very important. There are three reasons why we have barriers to participating in clinical trials. There is the individual level factors, which is majority of what we're going to talk about here, right? But I also don't want to lose the fact that there's also what is known as the protocol level factors. The protocol level factors, when we're thinking about, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, it's excluding us. If you say, the exclusion criteria, the exclusion criteria is Black, because the exclusion criteria is if you have this disease, if you have this disease, if you have this, if you have that,
you can't participate.
Things that we have, and so it's, this is one of the things that a lot of, and I'm very proud of our institution at Mayo Clinic. This is one of the things that we are looking at. We are looking at every protocol that we are writing to make sure that we are not doing implicit bias by having all this exclusion criteria that by definition is being Black, right? So automatically you are excluded. So there's the protocol level. In addition to that, protocol level could, has to do with the way you have the informed consent, the way you write it is not written in a way that people can really. So there's that. There's the health system levels barriers. Let's face it, there's discrimination, there's bias, there's marginalization. There, just like Dr. Johnson just said, it's like certain things we don't make that much effort to recruit that population. And then all the other side of things, we are over recruiting in this population. So if we can be high in this population, what did we do in that one that we couldn't have done in the one that is really for our community? And then as scientists, we also need to do a better job to make sure that even when we're talking about investigator-initiated trials, it's not all about what we are interested in, but it's what is going to help the community that we are in. What are those trials? Talking with people such as Dr. Kane. Dr. Kane, what are you seeing in your practice? What is the disease burden? What are some of the things that is going on? And how do we put a trial together to address what is being? So I want to make sure that everybody knows that. Now, going back to the individual level factors, I know we can talk about Tuskegee. We cannot disaffirm Tuskegee, but Dr. Johnson plainly, that's why it was so important for Dr. Johnson to talk at the beginning about what clinical trials are. She talked about the control level of clinical trial. There's phase 1, there's phase 2, there's phase 3, and there's post-marketing surveillance. It's so rigid, it's so well controlled now. We have all those things in places. And institutions know that if they don't do the right thing, they also are going to be in violation, and that may mean losing federal funding. So we are all investigators, and we are on our tippy toes to make sure. But I always tell my colleagues that it's not only even about the Tuskegee, it's about what we are experiencing right now. We are still experiencing discrimination in the healthcare system. We are still experiencing discrimination in recruitment for clinical trials. So although people are talking about that, sometimes it's what is going on right now with what we are experiencing and how we are being addressed and how we are being recruited, and the marginalization, the lack of respect that is making people say, whoa, 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 whoa. And the elephant in the room, the lack of representation and diversity of scientists and physicians who look like you, who look like us, who are able to say, you know what, I got you. If you remember very well, Mr. and Dr. Johnson, we did this with COVID-19, right? We had to, what was the most successful thing that we did in being able to recruit people to try us in COVID-19? We got the face of Black scientists and Black clinicians out there. I'm telling you, that was the most successful thing we could ever do. That was the way we recruited for people saying. And for me, at that point in time, I was at University of Florida. When even I was taking my COVID-1 shot, COVID-2 shot, University of Florida was live streaming it, was taping it. For me to be able to say, look, I'm Black, I'm a scientist, I've researched it, I have children, I have grandchildren, I'm taking it. I would not take it if I didn't trust it, right? So there are things that we can do, and there are things that I think are very, very responsive. But I don't want people who are in position to address this effectively to think it's because of what Tuskegee was. It's because of what we are doing right now.
It's so interesting. It's so interesting, Dr. Odetna, because having worked or continually working in the space of helping to dispel myths, I recall the video that I showed a group of folks called The Conversation. And when in that video, it was Black doctors who were featured in the video. And the one point that was made, one scene that was made in that video that resonated with the group of people that I talked to is when the president of the National Medical Association said all 4 HBCU medical centers or programs were involved in the clinical trials. That's when half the people in the room said, oh, now that I know there were Black doctors who were behind the clinical trials and Black people who participated in the clinical trials, then I feel better about taking it. So getting that information, putting your faces out there, and both of you have participated in town hall meetings that we've had. But guess what? If the people who we're trying to communicate with are not tuning into the town hall meetings, then they still don't know. But it's just a whole perception. But I want to get off COVID a minute because
I wanted to actually say exactly what that's also very important. As clinicians, we are very challenged in that clinical space. But the studies show that really your trust in even listening to someone about screening for a clinical trial is increased when that information comes from your primary care provider or your medical home. So it's important that actually our primary care providers, our clinicians in the primary care space, reacculturate their practices to include the consideration of clinical trials. And that's a hard thing to do. Obviously, I do that every day, and I know that's very hard, even being in the same building with clinicians, to introduce the trials that we have available right down the hall. So trials across the highway is a different challenge. But Dr. Kane and those who have been passionate about clinical trials, who are actually in the space of primary care and very astute to clinical trials and the benefit of clinical trials and the appropriate trials for the patients, because not everything is for everyone, like I always say, right? So Dr. Kane's experience, when Dr. Kane and I have connected in the COVID space, but way before COVID, one of the things that brought Dr. Kane and I together is his love for clinical trials. And as a family physician, he was a clinician and a physician scientist in the same space. And I think that was actually what helped this city to get more inclusion, more ethnic diversity in clinical trial space, whether it was sponsored by biopharma or whether it was in academic centers, because we had physicians we had patients who trusted their clinician. And while Dr. Kane may not have been doing the trial, because he said, I want you to consider this trial, that made a difference. So some of the onus is on us as physicians, as clinicians, as the front line in this community as well. And we are working on that. We're working on doing better to educate clinicians, to make it part of our normal conversations with our patients.
So one of the comments on here says, help me understand why I should participate in a clinical trial when I haven't used a new product of any type in the last 20 years.
I think it's like Dr. Detna said, this is not all about products, right? So I was on Facebook today I went to Hampton University, so all of you Florida people, I just have to make room to say that. I went to Hampton University, and one of my Hampton discussion groups was talking about the importance of sleep. And in that group chat, people were like, oh, I do fine with 4 hours. And others were like, I have to have 7. And we know from the sleep studies, no intervention, no new product, just sleep, something that is so underrated. We don't speak enough about the importance of sleep and how it affects our body. And so I chimed in to explain why the studies for sleep must include diverse populations, because we have already learned that there are specific genes that may be different that allows you to be more prone to chronic disease because of lack of sleep or too much sleep. And in those studies, which were well done, the associations have been made as we've isolated these specific genetic spaces. Well, if we're not identifying those genetic spaces in people of color, that story may not be the true story for those of us who are like trying to get, by on 5 hours of sleep. And unfortunately, like our challenge with things that we don't have symptoms for, like hypertension early on or kidney disease early on, we don't feel differently, right? So if we are getting away on 5 hours of sleep now, but in 20 years from now, we have to pay the price because we were more at risk for something, we could have intervened just by increasing our sleep cycle by 3 hours. I think that's the reason that we must continue to remember that, not only for interventional and product trials, but for just all of this body of knowledge that we use to manage patients. Everything in the clinical management space has to have some sort of integrity. And most of that integrity comes from the clinical trial space. And if you have an opportunity to contribute to any of that conversation or to participate in the data that allows us to have a bench to bedside conversations, I think that's important for all of us to be present. Dr. Kane, I'm sorry. You're on mute, Dr. Kane.
Dr. Kane, we can't hear you. I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I'm liking the ladies' conversation with ladies tonight, but go ahead, Dr. Kane. Still can't hear you.
We still can't hear you. Yeah. So while Dr. Kane is getting his mic on, I so agree with Dr. Johnson about it. When you say you haven't used a product in 20 years, I asked the question, have you looked at the trials that study exposure to sun to understand that vitamin D is so low in us that you need to be out there in the sun more? I mean, so it's not really about the products alone. It's about exposure to sun. It's about exercising. There are some things that talks about, maybe exercising so it's about nutrition, what we put in ourselves. So there is such a lot that has to do with trials that is not only about those therapies. And if you took the vaccine, and you took the COVID-19 vaccine, which I'm suspecting that maybe you did, then you really have used the product within the last 20 years. And I hope that you did take the COVID-19 vaccine. And if you took the flu shot also, it was a clinical trials that was done about that. So yeah.
So Dr. Detna, one of the things when Dr. Johnson mentioned that you've done a lot of work in cancer research, right? And most of us have some family member or we know someone who's had cancer, right? So are there, if for people who are listening to us and they said, you know what, I have unfortunately been diagnosed recently with cancer. I wish I knew that there was a research study that I could have found out about prior to my cancer diagnosis so that I may have known whether or not I was at risk. Is that something that could have been possible?
Absolutely. So, first of all, for all of us, if you really are at the stage that you're exploring and you've had what we said and you're exploring, am I eligible for any clinical trials or what are the clinical trials? I would just for us to go to the clinicaltrials.gov, which is really the site that provide all the trials that are going on it's a federal website that provides all the trials that's going on. You can see one that is like near you. I just also want to plug in my institution. You can go to Mayo Clinical Trials, Mayo website as well, and we have all the trials. As you know, Mayo Clinic is very well known for all the trials that we do. So we have all the trials that are right there. I'm also very proud of really a partnership with Dr. Kane as well as Dr. Johnson, because it's very important, as Dr. Johnson said, the family physicians, the people who really are community oncologists, especially minority community physicians. They are the first level. They've been in those communities. They know that community. They know what is best for those community. And I think, it's very important that, our partnership with them really turns towards the fact that they are able to inform scientists like myself that this is what is needed within the community. This kind of trials is missing in the community. So can you do something about that? And that is what I love about the relationship that I have with both Dr. King and Dr. Johnson, because they have their ear to the ground, right? They know, they deal with those communities. And for myself, I've been in academia for 30 years. And I always say that the most successful projects that I have done and the most successful and large funding that I have ever gotten has been in partnership with the community, has been in partnership with community physicians. So for example, recently we just got, this global Department of Defense award, phase 1, about over $3 million. Phase 2 is going to be about $15 million. And what the Department of Defense likes about this grant, and it's going to have a lot of clinical trials in it, and it's going to be here in Jacksonville, nationally, as well as in Africa. What Department of Defense loves about it is the connection that we have with the community, right? Is the fact that they know that we are working very closely with the community to identify the research that needs to be done and how best to do the research. And so to me, I'm very proud about the relationship that I have developed with people like Dr. Johnson and Dr. Kane, so that we are very responsive to our community. That is one of the things that we have not, as a scientist can say, we as scientists have not done a good job of saying that we want to do trials that is going to be beneficial to our community. I think one of the reasons that people are so reluctant is, what is this clinical trials going to do for me? Why is it being done? If I'm doing a clinical trials that is not going to benefit the community, or I'm not even going to take the result back to the community, or I'm not even going to do the best that I can, so that once those trials is done and the therapist and the intervention is done, that I'm going to bring the therapist back to the community, or I'm bringing the intervention back to the community. Why should the community trust me? Right? Why should the community trust me? So this is something, it's a game changer. And this is one of the reasons why representation matters, because guess what? Majority of the people, not all, there are some who are not part of a racial or ethnic group that are thinking the same way. But majority of the people who are thinking this way are people that come from this community and understand the issues that we have in the community and understand why it's so important to solve the problem within our community with clinical trials. One more thing I'm going to say before I keep quiet. Clinical trials offer you the best care that you could ever have. In fact, some people see clinical trials at the highest level of care. While we are struggling to have clinical trials for us to recruit in our Black communities, countries in Africa are fighting tooth and nail to have pharma bring clinical countries to their community, because they know it's a way for them to get the best care for people within their community.
Wow, thank you. Dr. Kane, are you back with us?
I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, finally.
I don't know what happened to the. I mean, I did drop the computer, and for whatever reason, it decided to want to act up tonight. I got to get it to our technology guru and have my computer replaced. Call Tyrone. You guys talked about a whole lot of things that I wanted to chime into, but I couldn't. And I go down my little laundry list real quick. One of the things was when it came down to I kind of wanted to ask the question, why are clinical trials or health studies so white? Okay, because there's a certain level of institutional racism that's associated with some of these clinical trials, in that you have a bunch of white males making decisions about what trials, what's exclusion criteria, and all this other kind of stuff that sometimes exclude women and minorities, black and browns and Indian, exclude them from some of the studies. One of the things that I back in 2015, he had about 31 cancer drugs. That's a fact I kind of took a look at myself, Dr. Johnson. 31 cancer drugs that was approved since 2015. 24 of those trials included less than 5% African Americans. And we get cancer as much as anybody else, and we represent 13.4% of the population. So, probably one of the big, if I want to talk about anything that we really should participate in clinical trial, there's a whole laundry list of things we should. But even when it comes down to cancer clinical trials, a lot of times when you get diagnosed with cancer, we may not have the right drug out there for you. But there may be a trial of a new drug that may actually cure that cancer, or at least extend your life without all the other detriments of previous drugs that cause you all kind of illnesses while you were previously approved drugs that caused you some issues while you were taking it from your hematologist. So, African Americans need to look at, because again, we get lung cancer, we get ovarian cancer, we get prostate cancer. Why not include us in those trials that may actually save my life? In particular, if I look at someone where they have no other option in terms of, you already given them a death sentence. Why not participate in a clinical trial that may reverse that death sentence? I know that's being, kind of a not facetious, but the bottom line is still, if I'm sentenced to die, and I have an opportunity to take something that might help me live longer or cure me, I want to participate in that trial. Now that's the extreme on one side in terms of cancer. On the other side,
Dr. Kane, though, before you move on from cancer, I just want to be in full transparency. I'm a graduate of Mayo Clinic, and the current director of our enterprise-wide cancer center has shared her experiences before coming to Mayo that I actually use now to share with my patients. She was part of a team that actually looked at childhood cancers, leukemias. And in looking at cancers, it wasn't about, testing out a product, but what was concerning was that the same product worked differently in terms of its cure rate in different populations. So you're using a product on two different populations, but one is living their best life after getting it, and the other group of children are not living. And it took a while before they were able to identify what was at the root of this. And at the root of this was a one little amino acid genetic change that, once fixed, allowed Black and brown children to live the same length of life with that treatment from cancer as white children. And so looking at that, it's not only about the old people or older patients and death sentences, but if that's my baby, and I have a couple, it becomes—
you do everything you can
absolutely
to give them an opportunity to live.
But for those children who were actually in that trial to benefit from that, they were the first to benefit actually from that information. Then that had to actually get out into the community. So for those who are looking for benefits, that's like one of the biggest benefits that you can experience in actually being privileged to be in a space where you actually benefit. Obviously, there are risks to all trials. There's risks to everything in the medical space. But those are conversations that we call, we're supposed to have conversations with our patients before we randomize them and include them in our trial. But you're also supposed to have these conversations. It's what we call shared decision making in the clinical space before we participate.
I have a question though. I have a question along that line though, real quick, Dr. Kane. I'm sorry. Because when you do clinical trials, Dr. Johnson or Dr. Odetna, when you do clinical trials, should I believe, as a person who doesn't have experience in participating in a clinical trial, that they're going to tweak the product, medication, or whatever, because my population does not react well to it? Are they going to make a drug the same main drug, but for two different populations? How does that work?
Yeah, and I know that's a question that, we often get, is this going to be different because I'm Black? Or, it's interesting because we do have studies that recruit exclusively minority patients. And what's funny is that people are less likely to Blacks are less likely to want to be in all Black trials sometimes, because they feel that all Black trials is offering something different or something inferior to the all white trials. We found that in one of the beta blockers that we tried, and said that this beta blocker, a hypertension med, was best used for African American blood pressure. Black patients didn't want to take it because it was developed only from Black patients. So it is a conversation. It's a conversation. But the answer to your question is no. Once a protocol is designed to test a product, the intervention and most of these things that we're talking about when it comes to new medications coming to market and new indications for medication are what we call randomized double-blind control trials. So I may not know the intervention that the patient is getting. The patient may not know. There is a group that actually knows, because we're randomizing them statistically, not based on any other factor. So there are safeguards that are in place. And once a trial is in place, unless we see very unusual things, I mean, sometimes we see that there's a benefit that we didn't expect to happen really early on. And so we have to stop the trial because it would be unethical for us to continue this knowing that the benefit exists. So there are things that could stop a trial. In the same way, if we see that there are a lot of safety signals that are coming up that we're concerned about, we're not going to continue recruiting patients to introduce them, because at the end of the day, it's still first do no harm, right? It's still first do no harm. So while harm may happen, it's not going to be an intentional harm, and it has to be a regulated and regimented and authorized within the regulatory body space risk that patients and patients, before they even get into trials, are given what we call an informed consent document. And that informed consent document is basically everything from A to Z that you'd want to know about the trial, what your rights are, what the obligations of the physicians who are taking care of you are, what we call the internal review board wants you to do if you feel that you're being violated, the numbers to call them, the numbers to call me. And you go through this, and you must attest to really understanding the full body of that information. And the reason that we don't necessarily recruit what we call desperate patients, or patients who may be more likely to want to be in a trial for reasons that may not be solely for their health, is because we don't want to have a bait and switch. We don't want you not to understand all of the risk and all of the benefits just for something else. Patients are not paid to be in clinical trials. They're given stipends for their participation in clinical trials. So there are times that certain trials are designed and says, we don't, unless you have a home, unless you've got a means to get to the clinical center, that we can't recruit you for the trial. Well, personally, as Dr. Detna says, we've been working really hard as a group of Black and brown scientists to really work against some of those things that keep you out of trials when it would be in your best advantage. You started saying that the trial that you were introduced to said you had to take off work and come in on Tuesday and Thursday of the first week, and Those are things that most normal people who are dependent on their lifestyle or with children, they may not be able to do. So we are working really hard, Dr. Detna more than I am, to decentralize the space. And the international community of trial scientists are actually looking at ways to meet patients where they are in trials. So, so not only is it standardized, to answer your question, but we're actually looking at more ways to make it easier for you to have the opportunity to be in clinical trials.
Thank you. Despite all that we've talked about, by the way, the same question keeps popping up from our audience. Why should I participate in clinical research?
Yeah, I'm happy to give that a shot. Why should you? So I'm going to just look into the camera and tell you why you should participate in clinical trials. Number one, the clinical trials test the efficacy and test the safety and to make sure that this drug is going to work in you and in people like you that look like you. So the reason we have to participate in clinical trial is to see whether this drug is effective and is going to work and is the right thing and is going to get out there to be with people that are like us. So you walk in, you know, other reasons that you want to participate in clinical trial is to contribute to scientific discovery. Like Dr. Johnson said, it's not about the payment that you are receiving. It's really sometimes about the altruism. Apart from the fact that we're going to know whether it is effective in you or not, it's about the altruism. And I think there's nothing much more clearer to us about participation in clinical trials than what we just had at COVID-19, right? If we did not participate in clinical trial and would not discover the vaccines that we discovered COVID-19, God forbid, only God knows where we all will be, right? And the continuation of this COVID-19 is what is now allowing us to know we need a booster shot, because with continuous participation of people in clinical trials, we know when the vaccine that we get, when it's now getting lower and when we need to get a booster. Now they're saying we need to really most probably get a fourth one, right? It is the same thing. It allows us to be able to know what is good and what is effective for us. You know, before I allow Dr. Johnson and Dr. King to add, I really do want to make this important point. Clinical trials is not the end all and be all. We have to start from basic discovery. So when that question pops out and says that, would I know whether it's working in my populations or not? Before it gets to clinical trials, if you had participated in basic research, for example, if you get your if you provided your tissue, if you provided your blood, if you provided your urine, if you provided your saliva, if you provided your hair sample, for some of the basic discoveries that we are doing in the area of genomic studies, right, and epi study and clinical study, that would allow us to be able to say, you know what, this is what we are finding in the lab. We are finding that the genes of Black populations is reactive to this or is not reactive to this. This is where discovery starts. So once we have that discovery, right, then it goes to disease discovery. Once we have that basic discovery, it goes to disease discovery and say, okay, how does it work with prostate cancer? How does it work with there are some studies that have already cleared that it does not work in Black population. So don't worry about this drug for Black population. But it comes from basic discovery to disease discovery, to drug discovery, to preclinical. We have to be part of everything. So when scientists are asking, you know, this is one of the things that we are working together with Dr. Johnson and Dr. King. When scientists are asking that, could you provide a blood sample so that we can test whether this particular drug component acts differently in us than it acts in white people? That is also very important, because that's when we start discovering whether it can be targeted or tailored to our population. This is what we are finding with vitamin D and prostate cancer, because all of a sudden we are finding that there's a lot of vitamin D deficiency with prostate cancer, and prostate cancer patients are being compromised because of that. And more so with Black folks, it is coming from basic discovery. So that basic discovery, drug discovery, disease discovery, preclinical, before we get to clinical trial, is also very important. That's why, you know, us saying it's okay, you can use my tissue. It's okay, you can use my blood. It's okay, you can cut, you know, you can get my hair. It's okay, you can get my saliva. It's okay, you can get my urine. So many things that we are using for basic discovery becomes very important, because at that stage, we can start tailoring what needs to be tailored to us before you get the clinical trial. I just want to mention that, because all those aspects of research are very critical. And that is when we know whether it's good for us or it's not good for us, the basic discovery aspects of it. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that.
So people, a couple of things. How do people participate in clinical trials? And secondly, if someone's listening and they have a family history of breast cancer, right? I know people who've said that their doctor told them that they need to start with they looked at the whole family. The younger females need to make sure that they get mammograms at an earlier age. Well, is there a test or something that a person can take to see whether or not they have that unlucky gene and will probably later on down the line, get breast cancer? Is there anything that people can do to see if they are at risk of developing a disease that they know has been prevalent in their family? If that makes sense.
Yes, and that doesn't happen, and that doesn't have to happen in the research space. Science has advanced because of research to allow you in the clinical space to have those conversations with your physician. And if you're having those conversations, you can be referred for genetic testing or genetic consultation using your family history and your diagnosis or concern about diagnosis. Being given information about the test, the sensitivity, how accurate that test is, how likely it is to find what it needs to find. And so that's where the conversation starts. The conversation starts way before even participation in a trial per se. There are trials that can look at those who are at risk for certain things, but you don't have to, if you're hesitant about participating in clinical trials, to answer that question, you don't have to wait on the clinical trial to get that information right now in 2022.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely agree with that. You can get that from your clinician, and you can have the text in the BRCA gene. And I want to, this, great question. I want to say, Ms. Great question. The discovery of the BRCA gene in us was from basic discovery. So when basic discovery was done about the BRCA gene, right, as linked to breast cancer, that is when people started looking for drugs to target those drugs. So this sort of really emphasizes my point that our ability, and this, the great news is that we have never been in a better time than we have now. I'll give you an example. The chair of President Biden's Cancer Advisory Group is Dr. John Captain. He is a brother. He is a Black man for the very first time. This man is one of the topmost genetic scientists in the world. And guess what? He focuses all his studies in discovering genes in Black that are predisposed to cancer. That is his life work, right? So we are in a time that we have representation for the first time. And this representation is allowing us to do all the discoveries that we need to do. So we are just saying to our community, let's play our part, right? We have the clinicians, we have the scientists who represent us, who are playing up their part. You can now have confidence in the process. I'm just saying that.
As we herald those things that are improving in our nation's capital, I want to bring to your attention, Jocelyn, that there are actually 2 bills that I don't know how they're going to evolve, but the Diverse Trials Act is currently S 2706, and that was introduced in the Senate in August of last year to diversify investigations in research studies for everyone in the United States. And really what it's calling the FDA to do is to provide guidance for decentralization, or making it more accessible, clinical trials more accessible, to promote meaningful demographic and geographic diversity in patient engagement, enrollment, and participation. This isn't about us having a desire for you to participate. This isn't about the companies, profiting or losing on their trials. This matter is so important that we are actually making legislation to hold accountable the very body that holds us all accountable, to make sure that they're not approving. As you saw, they have to take the information that they have to get things to the market. If we were to wait on us, all of these, if we had to meet a 10% or 15% inclusion, a lot of studies would not have come to the market. So what the FDA is saying is, okay, we understand that you have not had diversity and the studies have been sound and the drugs have been worthy of bringing them to market. But we're going to hold you accountable to make sure that you're providing to every company, every individual, every academic center that is bringing anything before you, to make sure that you have a litmus test to test that they have done everything within their power to diversify that study, and not just to say, well, there are no Black people in Utah. It doesn't matter. We want you to do everything within your power, and it's actually before both the House and the Senate in equally worded language, and it's in the Senate. It's the Diverse Trials Act. We can follow that, and we'll tell you on another podcast how that's going. But lastly, just to piggyback off of the conversations about breast cancer and other things, I better not because my dog's starting to bark. But
okay, while you mute yourself, I just want to follow up with what Dr. Johnson is saying when I said it's an exciting time. Now, the body that controls clinical trials for us is the FDA. I want to let you know the person who is the director for health equity and diversity of these trials at FDA. Her name is Dr. Fashoyin Ajay. She is a Black woman, and I have talked to her personally, and she has shared a vision. She is taking the pharma to task, not only for you to just come and say, oh, I wasn't able to recruit, blah, blah, blah. She is asking, what have you done in those communities? The effort that you have put in to make sure that there's recruitment going on. So we are at a time, in fact, that even the pharma companies are now aware that, okay, this is not, business as usual. Because again, representation matters, because the person who is now leading the diversity, who happens to be a Black woman, is saying, I want to see what you've done. This is not business as usual. We got to get this right. And she's also developing programs that talks to the decentralization, right? And I want to, they're not going to say, but Dr. King and Dr. Johnson are one of the people who are leading the decentralization within our Northeast region, and I'm proud to say, working with us at Mayo Clinic to ensure this decentralization is taking place. Because sometimes we have the barriers when we say we want them to come to us, but no, we have to go to people where they are. So it's very important that we look at decentralization. And one of the things that Mayo Clinic is doing is often, changing things. I can't say the word out of my mouth, but changing things in such a way that we're even looking at being able to do clinical trials at home, using a great platform that allows you to be able to, so that we come to you and you don't necessarily have to come to us. These are some of the things that we're looking at and we're trying to do in partnership, of course, with community physicians like Dr. King and Dr. Johnson, to make sure that we are really doing right by our community.
So thank you, Dr. Odebna. We've had a real good discussion. And, someone just put in the chat, like, while they really appreciate you all and all that you said, I'm just an average Joe. So, we've gone over our hour. We don't like to keep you nor our listeners too long. And it's a conversation that we obviously can continue in the future. But we always like to ask our guests to please share your final thoughts with our listeners, because we know that some of our topics are a little heavier than others. And I consider this a heavier one because some people feel that it's a very heavy burden to bear to make a decision to participate in clinical research. So if you would, Dr. Odebna, please share your final thoughts on why minorities should consider participating in clinical trials as we end the program this evening.
Yeah, that is really very important. This is what I always say about clinical trials. I always want us to think about one thing. Everything that comes out, whether it's the drug, whether it's the devices that we use, whether it's interventions to make us healthier, or whether it's what is going to make improve our quality of life or improve the number of years that we have, not only for us, but for all our loved ones. Think about it. For your wife, for your husband, for your brothers, for your sisters, for your mom, for your dad, for your children, for your generations to come. All those things that are being discovered to help us deal with things are all based on clinical trials. And so we have to think about that our population is a very unique population. Our population is not like all the other population, right? We have, African ancestry that has very diverse gene pool. We have admixtures through intermarriage that has going on. We have environmental factors. If you remember, when we all came from Africa here to the United States, the environment that we were in is not the same as the environment that they found ourselves. Over the years, that has led to chronic conditions like cardiovascular diseases because of the salt intake that we were not used to. And so it becomes very important that we are part of the decision making. Let's think about it as decision making. If a decision is going to be made about something that I'm going to end up using, whether it's Tylenol, whether it's another drug, whether it's for oncology, whether it's exercising, whether it's vitamin D supplement, if a decision is going to be made, then we need to know for sure that that decision is being made with our population in mind. And so my take home would be, I would rather that decision is made under control condition that I know they will find out for sure than for that decision to be made under uncontrolled condition. Because after it has been made, like I said, and like Dr. Johnson said, there are some drugs that are therapies and interventions that have been released with 0% of our population participating. But they've been approved. And we are using them. And guess what? Under uncontrolled condition. So we might use them and feel some sort of way, but we're not thinking is the drug that we use because it was never developed for us. We don't understand. So it's really very important that we take this very seriously, not only for ourselves, but for our loved one as well.
Thank you, Dr. Odetna. Dr. Johnson, what are your final thoughts for as we end the discussion tonight? And it's okay if your dog is not cooperative.
God knows they're not right now. But first of all, thank you for this opportunity again. I think we've said all that we can say in a space such as this in the past hour, but it's very important that we recognize that we need all parties at the table. And that includes patients and providers and the regulatory bodies. We need all parties at the table. We've been working really hard to make sure that we can do all that we can do with what we have evolved in the scientific space. And yet, we still have a greater burden of disease than any other group of people. We are still at a space where we're dying at higher rates from things that other people are finding treatment in that space. We need to do better. We're trying to do better, but we can't do it because we want to will it. We can only do it if we have those who are willing to be heroes in this space with us, who are willing to find personal answers for families, answers for communities in this space because they trust us, and in this space because we as a community simply need to do better. Our forefathers did it for us in so many ways. If there were not those who were willing to go the extra yard to provide the privileges that we have today, we could not live the lives that we have today. We are standing on their shoulders. In the medical space, this is no different. We must really look and dig deep and lean in on our privilege that we have each and every day to get up, and yet recognize that we are still multiple times greater in many disease processes than people not of color to die of or to be chronically ill unnecessarily in many cases from these diseases. So thank you again for the opportunity, and I hope that resonates with at least one of us.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Kane, you've been rather quiet tonight, and that's, I must admit, that's a rare occasion, Dr. Kane, but I'd like for you also to share your final thoughts about our discussion tonight.
Well, I think my computer had a lot to do with that. So I can't, there's nobody I can beat up on that one. But I would like to say a couple of things real quick. Um, for the simple answer as to why we need to participate is that basically studies have shown that the different ethnicities have distinct genetic mutations that increase their risk for a particular kind of diseases and affect how they may respond to different medicines. So, for instance, African American children have died 10 times the rate of white children as a non. Sorry, African American children have died 10 times the rate of non Hispanic white children as it relates to asthma. And so we need to kind of specifically direct studies to see what worked best in those children. There's also been issues, as Dr. Odetna said, in terms of our country of origin, the place we originated from. We had a totally different genetic, whether it's genotype or phenotype, meaning what you are on the outside versus what you are genetically on the inside, that causes us to be different than our white counterparts here, such as our conservation of salt versus their conservation of salt. And so when you wind up getting certain foods and other things that increase the risk for high blood pressure in Africans, and I'm gonna say African, but African Americans, when you do that, you're gonna note that we need a different modality of treatment. For the physicians out there, what we do understand is that they're one of the reasons that they don't participate. I'm mainly talking to primary care physicians. One of the reasons that they don't participate, there's a lot of enrollment barriers out there due to the physicians they're being understaffed and the lack of resources for them to introduce clinical trials to their patients. But I want them to realize that they have a lot of power in persuading their patients to participate in clinical trials. When I did clinical trials as a primary care physician, I never had problems recruiting patients, honestly, because my motto was always, I would not do a trial that I would not allow my mother, brother, son, sister, daughter, my relative to participate in, all things being equal. And so my patients rely on the fact that if I'm going to do it for them, I'll do it for my family and vice versa. So I think there's a lot to be discussed. We missed out on a lot in terms of being able to have people get a little bit, particularly the non-clinicians, getting a little bit better understanding of what it means to participate in clinical trials. But we'll be back with part 2 of that so that we can be sure that those patients get a true understanding of why it is necessary, why it is important to participate in clinical trials. Even at my age, it's necessary for me to do it. If not for me to save my life, but it may save my children's life because they are my seedlings. So whatever may work in me may work in them as well.
Thank you, Dr. Kane, and thank you.
I know we're over, but I wanted to leave 2 resources with this group because my soul is unrested because we have some unrest within the audience. One, I'd like for those who are resource savvy on the computer just to go Google National Medical Association or NMA Impact 2. And I think if you look at that, there's a lot of information and a lot of links regarding the work that's being done, particularly in the African American community, and with information that's put out there and led by Black doctors. The leading organization of Black physicians in this country is leading Impact 2. So Google Impact 2 NMA. And then for anything regarding the FDA, I would like for you to consider going to www.fda.gov/health equity. So it's www.fda.gov/health equity. And that will give you lots of information, again, and lots of links on clinical diversity in trials. And we'll also provide you some very seamless one pagers and fact sheets about why to or not to consider clinical trials. So I just wanted to leave those who may not have understood everything that we said tonight an opportunity to go and do a little bit more research on their own.
Thank
And
you,
it will
Dr.
be on
Johnson.
our website. They will that information she just gave will be on our website. So
Thank you. And Dr. Odetna, did you have a reference, a resource where people can go to participate in clinical trials with Mayo?
Yeah, absolutely. If you just go to the Mayo Clinic website, we have a list of all the clinical trials that are ongoing, and so you can just Google Mayo Clinic clinical trials, and you'll have a list of all the ones that are near you, whether in Florida, Rochester, or Arizona, or even globally. We do have a global team ongoing that you could. Another resource that I will leave is that and I hope that it will be on the podcast website as well, is clinicaltrials.gov. Go to the clinicaltrials.gov, it will be able to. And I also wanted to leave it that, I do really appreciate coming on here. I've really, truly enjoyed myself. So thank you to Dr. Kane and Ms. Turner. But, another thing that we're doing is that we are really, at Mayo Clinic, we are training citizen scientists to be able to support the community and educate them about clinical trials. So if you are interested in also being trained for citizens as a citizen scientist to educate others about clinical trials, also contact us at Mayo Clinic as well, and I will provide all this the direct links to both Dr. Rogers and Ms. Turner to be up on the website. So thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. Truly a pleasure. I hope to be back.
Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Odetna and Dr. Johnson. Tonight's discussion was a very interesting one. We use many products every day. We eat a lot of things that we don't think about. We just know historically we like what we like. We never thought about who made them. We just know we like them for whatever reason. As new things have come about, as we've seen, unfortunately, with COVID-19, it was a new phenomenon for all of us. We weren't around when tuberculosis was running rampant, if you will, in our community. Scoliosis, so many other things, right? So we just know that fortunately we have scientists like Dr. Johnson and Dr. Odetna who decided that they wanted to be a part of the space of knowing what is being used, the impact that it has on the people that they come in contact with, our family members who are living now, but also for many generations to come. If you were not inspired by the discussion to get involved in clinical trials, then you need to stay tuned when we have our next conversation about clinical trials, because I can say from our discussion tonight, I am even more inspired, and I am going to look up clinicaltrials.gov, fda.gov/health equity. And I missed the NMA one, so we're going to get that from Dr. Johnson to make sure that we make all of those available to our listeners. But I also would like to remind you to stay tuned next week as we have our discussion on diabetes. It is a disease, unfortunately, that so many people in our community is being diagnosed with. We're going to talk about how to lower your risk, how to manage the disease if you have been diagnosed. We can't close the show without talking about Tyrone Jackson, our technology expert, for all that he brings to this space to make sure that technologically we operate. If you're looking for a technology guru, call Tyrone.net and he will take care of all of your computer needs. Thank you again, Dr. Odetna. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. And of course, our co-host, Dr. Rogers Kane. Tune in next week for pauseforthetruth.com. Good night, everybody.
Bye.